I lived at 740 Grand Concourse. Across the street from the other park. And I have no idea what the name of that park was. And then 2 more lanes northbound. And I think there was a concrete divider. There were 2 lanes southbound. And you stayed on, by the way, the staggered lights are on the inside 2 lanes.
Inside 2 lanes?
Yeah, the outside lanes, you got parking spaces and...
I was going to say, it's
yeah.
okay.
It's like the 4 lanes.
I'm Barry Adler, and I'm Tony's stepbrother, or we can now say we're brothers. And I came into his life 30 plus years ago when his father married my mother, and then I got to know him. And so we shared the whole 20 years or so of their marriage. And then when they passed on, we kept in touch, of course, and we would come up here occasionally to City Island and go on the boat, and got to see his model trains and the other things that he did. And the great thing that's gone on now is that I've gotten to meet so many of the friends that he knew over the years that I didn't know, and so it's like a growing family now. So.
I'm Hallie Wolf, Tony's arch enemy for many, many years. I've known Tony since he was 21, and we met at Pleasantville Music Theater, backstage, and we worked backstage forever together. At least until my daughter was born, and I felt that Tony would be a bad influence on her. So he was a total madman, as I'm sure Marcia and everybody who knows him know, and he was just fun to be around and lively, and right until the end. He was loud. He always spoke as though he were on the deck of a ship or backstage, so you could hear him at a great distance, and he was a great storyteller and a great showman. Actually, we worked at Croton Point together. I was the drama director at there was a music and arts camp at Croton Point, which is near his home. And he got me fired. And I never told him that he had gotten me fired from this job. But he had the kids at the camp working on the lights and climbing up. There were these sort of rafters. It was outside a very rustic sort of brown cabin, and which is now I think a little store or something on the point. But in any case, there was a stage in front of it, and these rafters, and he had the kids walking on top of them, hanging the lights. And I wasn't asked back the next summer. There were a few complaints from the parents who saw this.
I'm Kara Lee Ballard, and back in the late 80s, Tony and I lived together for a couple of years. We both grew up as yacht club brats at the Stuyvesant Yacht Club, but since Tony was about 17 years older than me, I guess for the first, probably 20 years of my life, I was probably a bit young, but then I got into my mid-20s, and I guess all of a sudden I wasn't a bit young, and we lived together for a couple of years, and we raced together, and I loved Tony very much. I did move out because he smoked like a fiend back then, and it was hard to watch him do that to himself. But as he said to me in Calvary one night, he said, I'm really lucky you left me when you did, because if we'd gotten married, I would have been a terrible husband, we would have had a terrible divorce, and then you wouldn't be here now. Tony is responsible for the fact that I love football. I couldn't have cared less about football, and he was watching it, and I walked into the living room, and there on the screen in living color was Joe Montana, the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. And I said, "Who's that?" And he said, "That's Joe Montana. He's the quarterback." I said, "Oh, really?" And I sat down. Tony proceeded to explain the entire game of football to me in relation to Joe Montana. Every single position on the field related to Joe Montana. Even the defense, somehow, he related to Joe Montana. So I have him to thank for the fact that I really love football. I also have him to thank for one of the most frightening moments of my life. Tony was responsible for erecting the tent at the Lyndhurst estate every year, and we all helped out, and my job was parking. I made sure the cars didn't park too close to the trees so they wouldn't damage the roots. So I would be looking up at the branches and going like this and then this. So we got home late at night, and I'm sitting in the kitchen combing my fingers through my hair, and out pops probably the biggest bug I'd ever seen, which evidently had come out of the tree and decided my hair was a nice place to hang out. And eventually he managed to peel me off the ceiling, but I've never forgotten about finding that bug in my hair. Tony also gave me some of the most exquisitely beautiful moments I've ever experienced, because although I grew up sailing, my father had a day sailor, and therefore we did not go cruising. So in August one year, we sailed up the Connecticut shore, and Tony decided to go to sleep and leave me in charge of all 14,000 pounds of Al Viento from about midnight to 4 a.m. and the stars were out, and there I was in control of Al Viento and trimming the sails, and it was just beautiful, and I have him to thank for that.
I'm going to start at the beginning. I was 15 years old in the mid-60s, and was somewhat at a loss of where I was going. And someone suggested, my sister actually suggested, that all I needed to do was get involved with community theater. And so I walked into the auditorium of the Beechwood Players and had hair down to my collar, you know, which was long in those days. And there was a crew there run by Tony Sklarew, and that was my first meeting there. And Tony immediately took me under his wing, and I would say any of the stagecraft that I learned, any of the technical aspects of theater, I learned from Tony. And in the course of our relationship and I learned he was really probably the most generous person that I've ever met in my life. A true friend, someone that you could not talk to for 2 or 3 years, and when you talked to him again, it was like immediately you were back to where you were. And in the course of my life, I would say probably Tony was the most, besides my parents, the most influential person that I've ever met. The whole arc of my life would have been different had it not been for him. From the stagecraft, we also, I met a friend of his named Claude Hayne, who was involved with a band, and that's how I got involved with a band, with that band, with Elephant's Memory. Because Claude needed somebody who had the stagecraft and the knowledge of the theater, which I learned from Tony. So fast forward that career, but then years later, after I got out of the band, I was working in Tony's basement, and I met a fella named Steve Wixman, and from Steve Wixman I got a job at Cambridge Medical. And from Cambridge Medical I met a woman who got me into General Motors, where I spent 30 years as an electrician. So it really all stemmed from Tony's connections and Tony's influences. Just a guy who, I told him before he passed, when I visited him at hospice, that he's the kind of person who never met a stranger. He will talk to anybody, he will befriend anybody, and bring them into his sphere.
My name's Bob Parker. I met Tony approximately 1977 through Alan Mickey, who was working with Tony, and I was not affiliated with Tony through his sailing. I was affiliated with Tony through his work with Altman Stage Lighting and doing stage shows. In particular, I worked with Tony when he did the Westchester Philharmonic Orchestra at the Lyndhurst facility in Tarrytown, and I did tent setup and tent teardown, and I did other different shows that Tony was willing to take me to. We did a J.C. Penney show one day where we did a setup for him in Manhattan, where we set up for a fashion show, which was interesting. And I did work with him in his house, in his basement. We did work repairing stage lighting cables and electronics for bands, in particular Twisted Sister, which was one of the bands whose equipment needed fixing regularly. And over the years, since I lived locally at the time, I was expected to stop by and see Tony regularly, talk to him, make sure he was okay being a single guy, living alone. And we just continue to have a loving and warm relationship and friendship. I was very honored to know Tony. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. A wonderful man. Full of great stories. And I'd have to say that to everybody he met, everybody felt the same way. That you enjoyed knowing him. He would always help you. He would always bring things to the table that you could learn from, and he always gave you a good laugh. And in particular, for those that get to see this, I was one of the people who regularly brought his chocolate chip cookies to him, and there was a lot of story behind his chocolate chip cookies.
Bob and I live here on City Island, and when I met Bob, we were both sailors in our own lives, so we never had a boat really, but we did find Tony, the Commodore, at Stuyvesant Yacht Club. So here we are on City Island. We are settling in. My son is born here, and that's how we got to know Tony, as Commodore of the of the Stuyvesant Yacht Club. And here on City Island, we all love being out on boats. My son Evan has sailed all the way out on the Vineyard race with Tony several times. In fact, he was happy to be on the crew when they won first place for their division. Very exciting crew. And we just loved Al Viento, the beautiful boat, and his stories. Everyone remembers his sense of humor. He was the greatest. So we will miss him very much, and when we're out on the water, we think of him.
My name is Laura Marcus. I worked with Tony for many, many years at Altman Lighting, and he was always just a pleasure to work with. I can't say more nice things about him. He was humanitarian. He had so many patience. I mean, he was such a good teacher, such a good person. He was just fantastic. I mean, if you had a technical question, he was the man you spoke to. He knew every light inside and out, and he'll explain it to you until you get it right. You know, he had all the patience in the world, and he was just amazing. He was brilliant. What a great man. Loved him very much, and I can't say anything else about him, but I just, and this is a wonderful day, a beautiful tribute to him, and he deserves it, and it's an honor to be here to celebrate his.
I want to get a whole lot of thanks out first. First of all, I'd like to thank the Morris Yacht Club for being such a wonderful host to work with. You guys have a beautiful club here, really. And Katie McCormick, who's the head of the catering operation, was a joy to work with, and all of the staff. We have Marcello and Robert. They have been great. And all of the Morris members who are here, you have a wonderful club, and I'm so glad that all of the members from Morris are here. I would especially also like to thank, moving on to a different set of thanks, Barry Adler and Hallie Wolf. Barry is Tony's brother, and Hallie is Tony's dear, dear friend of many, many, many years. And the three of us have worked together since Tony passed away to make sure that everything Tony wanted is happening. And I couldn't have two better people to work with. They have made what could have been a truly difficult time so much easier to get through, and I am just so grateful to Barry and to Hallie for all of the emotional support that they have provided during this time. And also, someone who's not here, Tony's sister, Marcia, who's in San Francisco, we have her to thank for Ken, our videographer, who is going to record every word we say. So keep it clean. And we have an under 18-year-old here, so really, guys, keep it clean. We will be making a trip, a final voyage with Tony out to execution after 3 o'clock today. And I would love to thank Ed Chalet for agreeing to be our flagship vessel for Tony's final voyage. And I would also like to thank Bob Barent, Jack Valdovinos, Sam Cassell, and Bill Brender. And one other person who just volunteered, but whose name has flown out of my head, who volunteered their boats to transport everyone who wants to accompany Tony out to execution. We are very, very grateful that you have volunteered your boats, and Ed has done a fabulous, wonderful job at keeping everyone organized. And if you are interested, we will do our best to try to accommodate everyone who is interested in setting out on this rather gloomy, possibly rainy day. I would like to also thank Evan Barent, who put together the music that was up until a minute ago playing. All of the music comes from Tony's favorite music. So if you hear something very strange, it has nothing to do with Evan. This is all Tony's favorite music. By strange, I was, I guess, referring to Frank Zappa. But if you hear Frank Zappa, this is Tony's favorite music. And also Gilbert and Sullivan, Tony's favorite music. I would like to thank Yuri for providing us with a very special recording. Yes, with a very special recording, we will actually get to hear Tony's words at one point, and you just let me know and everybody will get quiet. And also, I don't know if there were any group of people more important to Tony than his crew. And Yuri was responsible for putting together denim, of course, denim shirts with the Al Viento logo that I was able to give to some of our more senior crew members, and also the newer crew members who got them. And if somebody who got one of the mementos could just hold it up, Kim Petrowski, who is not here but was one of Tony's crew members, under Tony's direction, had, Dave Botkin will be holding it up, he made these beautiful, heavy glass mementos that say the show must go on, the years Tony sailed on El Viento, the comedy and tragedy masks to represent his time in the theater. They're beautiful. And I have a list where I'm sitting. The crew member list was dictated to me by Tony while we sat together in Calvary. And there are people on that list either I don't know or I can't find. So if you could drop by my table, everyone I can't find or can't contact is highlighted in yellow. So if anybody can find one of the highlighted yellow people, I would love to get them their memento. And I want to thank Kim, who is not here because she is currently on a trip to Ireland. And I would never tell anybody to cancel a trip to Ireland. I would like to thank my dad, I believe the most senior life member of the Stuyvesant Yacht Club, although I shouldn't say that because that can be a scary position to be in. He was able to recommend a lot of people who were no longer at Stuyvesant who should be contacted and invited, and that was very important to be able to do. And Jeanette Westfall, who I don't know if she's here yet, also provided help on that front and also provided a lot of legal help to Tony when it was needed. And Bob Barrett was also instrumental in helping to gather the boats for our little excursion. Thank you, Bob. That was the one thing I was panicking over. As difficult as something like this can be when you lose someone you love, it always helps to have someone you love there 24/7. And that would be Tim, my husband. Anybody who thanks me for being there for Tony should thank Tim for being there for me. There's a table behind us with trophies and mementos. These were all in Tony's house. They are unclaimed, and Hallie and Barry have no idea what to do with them. So they are here, and if any of you would like to take them home with you, if they mean something to you, please do.
So I'm Barry Adler. I came into Tony's life somewhere in the 1970s. His mom had passed away, and Harold knew my cousin Steve. And my cousin Steve was an interesting guy. One of the things he did was he set people up with other people. He actually turned it into a business, and his calling card was, "I guarantee you the perfect relationship." Well, he introduced Harold to my mother, and I think for a long time that was a perfect relationship. They got together, they got married, and Tony inherited me, I inherited him. Tony also inherited my sister, Sandy, and so we became this larger group. It's a measure of Tony's rich life, or Harold's rich life, let's say, as well, that even before Estelle, Harold had a family. And so Tony had two half-sisters, Marcia and another Sandy, just to confuse the matter a little bit. Sandy unfortunately passed away last year. Marcia, gratefully, is very much with us and couldn't make it here today, nor could my sister. And so there's this bigger and bigger group. And so I spent a number of years marveling at Harold first, and then at Tony, and the magic of both of them. And I'm in awe of all the things they both did over the years. And I've sort of come to appreciate that much, much more, ironically, with Tony's passing, because I've spent more time at his house. And I've gone through the house and seen the model trains that he had, and the sailing equipment that he had, and the tool room that he had that, you know, I'm not very handy, but I love tools, and he had tools I'd never heard of or seen before. Amazing things. And so I've gotten to know him better in a way through this. But I also discovered, it was almost archaeology, as I went through the house, I found the matchbook from my sister's wedding in 1961 that I don't have, now I do. I found cards I'd sent to my mother who, from Europe when I was a kid, and now I have that again. And then I found, of course, all the things of Tony's, and I've taken some, and now he's with me that way. It's been very rich experience for me, but the richest part has been getting to know many of you. I knew of you, I've met some of you at some point, but I didn't appreciate how many wonderful people he had in his life. And it says a lot, it says everything about him, that he had so many wonderful people.
I've been at Stuyvesant for 30 years. That makes me a life member now. I've got 1 foot in Stuyvesant and 1 foot in the City Island Yacht Club. So when I joined Stuyvesant in 1985, I didn't know anybody and I didn't know anything, you know, like most of us new sailors. And, you know, after going to a couple of meetings and hanging around the place, trying to go out sailing with an old boat with lines that used to break in the middle of the day, I started to learn who were the people who were the real leaders. And I realized that this guy, Tony Sklarew, was one of the great leaders of Stuyvesant Yacht Club. So he was really quite a leader. And I learned also that not only was he was Commodore several times. I think he was chairman of the board several times. And there's a computer term, which I knew I couldn't remember. What is it called again? What is it? Default. Yeah, Tony Sklarew was the default Commodore of Stuyvesant Yacht Club. If there was a problem, Tony would step in and he would take care of it. You would know who to go to. You know, he was a leader in other ways too. He decided, well, okay, I'm going to be Commodore. I'm going to come in Friday nights. Let it be known that I'll be coming in Friday nights. So he would come early, he would have a drink at the bar, sit down and eat dinner, and lo and behold, there'd be a gathering of people sitting around him, talking around him, just to be with him, hear him tell his tales, hear him give his advice. He would come one afternoon a week, and he'd have a group of people who he'd be teaching marlin spike to. You know, he knew so much about the rules of the club constitution. He knew them by heart, and he knew so much about the racing rules. Whatever the rules were, you know, he really knew. So he was a terrific leader, and of course he was a great sailor. One of the things he asked me to do was become secretary of Stuyvesant Yacht Club, which I did, and I started writing a column called About Our Members, and so write something about some of the members, which I thought would be interesting. And the first person I wrote about was Tony. So I figured he was the Commodore, I should write about him first. So I met him, I said, look, I'd like to meet with you, where can we talk? So he said, I'm going to the railroad show. I said, what? He said, the railroad show. I said, what's that? He said, well, I learned, of course, that he's very interested and knows an awful lot about railroads, railroad cars, railroad tracks, and all that sort of thing, toy railroads. So we went to this show someplace, wherever it was, in northern New Jersey, and we sat down at a table, and we started talking about his life. I would interview people. As a retired physician, I got into the habit of taking people's history. So I always used to ask about how they got into sailing and things like that. And I discovered that his parent, his father was Commodore of Stuyvesant, so he was born into Stuyvesant, more or less. As a matter of fact, he was born on City Island, on the east side of City Island, on a boat. His mother was pregnant, like 9 months or so, and naturally she was on the boat with her husband. And she went into labor. So word got out she was in labor, so some doctor, I don't know who it was, who was a member of Stuyvesant Yacht Club, ran across the island to wherever they were, got on the boat and delivered it. So born on a boat, Tony. Let's see, so as far as the railroad goes, I couldn't leave that railroad show without what? I bought a train set. Now I'm trying to give it away. But anyway, So he was a pretty feisty guy, Tony. Somewhat opinionated. Not somewhat. Very opinionated. Most of you know this. And I was talking one day to Tony and Frank Toronto, and Tony just happened to mention something which took me a complete surprise. He said he was Jewish. I said, "What, you're Jewish?" He said, "Yeah, I was born Anthony Sklarew." And his father changed his name some years ago. He said, "What do you think I was?" I said, "I thought you were a feisty little Irishman." So anyway, I just want to say that I went to visit him at the hospice center. I forget, what was the name of that place again? Calgary. It was a beautiful facility. Very high-spirited, clean, very nice. And wouldn't you know it, when I walked into the room, instead of being greeted with a smile and saying, "Oh, hi, I'm so glad to see you," I got the Tony greeting. You.
I met Tony actually in 1981 at, we were doing a show, he liked Gilbert and Sullivan, we were doing Pirates of Penzance at Lyndhurst Castle on the Hudson. Tony was in charge of everything, including the tent. Well, we were performing, and the rain came down and you couldn't hear, so they had to stop the performance. Then the rain stopped, and then we went on, and then the rain came down, and thunder and lightning hit, and Tony was in charge of the tent. Well, the water was starting to build up in the tent, so he goes over to the side to release the water in the tent. Well, they say timing is everything in life, because at the exact same moment that he was releasing the water, a lightning bolt hit the transformer up on the hill, and all the lights went out, and people screamed. So of course people thought those screamers got hit by lightning. Instead, they were getting wet from what was coming off the roof. So that's how I met Tony. But the famous story is the Halloween party at Stuyvesant. So I was looking out at Eastchester Bay. It was so beautiful, you know. And I hear rah, 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 behind me. So I go, "Oh, Tony." I turn around, look, nobody there. I said, "Where's Tony?" So I turned around like this, directly behind me. I see this guy, like a Wall Street guy, dressed neat suit, natty, white shirt, tie, short haircut, clean shaven, and I focused in on his lips. And here's the voice coming out of these lips, out of this Wall Street banker. And I said, "Tony?" "Yeah, what do you want?" You know. So he said nobody recognized him. It took me a minute and a half.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Geronimo. First of all, I'd like to apologize for my attire. My wife Lynn and I have a wedding to go to this afternoon, and I am sure that this is not Tony-appropriate clothing. And I'm sure he'd be horrified that I'm wearing this. Anyway, I first met Tony at Altman Stage Lighting sometime in the middle 1970s, when I first started out in stage lighting with some of the local community theater groups. I was fortunate to learn about Altman so that I had an alternative to American stage lighting in New Rochelle. Tony and I hit it off right away, and I always looked forward to the opportunity to make a trek over to Yonkers to pick up a rental or a return. As our friendship grew, I got involved with the Lyndhurst tent setup crew. There was always a great crew of people working on that project. After a few years, Tony asked me what I was doing one 4th of July weekend and asked if I wanted to go sailing. Well, I've never been on a sailboat before, and I was suddenly thrust into a few years of Wednesday nights on the Long Island Sound. This was something I always enjoyed and I will always look back on as one of the best activities I've ever experienced. It was great for me. It was great, really great, because Tony had the boat and I just had to show up. Unfortunately, it was only a few years worth, as I ended up moving up to Upper Westchester County, and the ride home on Wednesday nights just got to be a little bit too much. But I always did try to make it down to City Island once a year. But enough about how I got to know Tony. I'm sure we all have a story like mine. What I really want to talk about is Tony, the storyteller. Oh my God, could he tell a story? There were stories about working on the World's Fair, stories about running follow spot at Woodstock, a story about when he got his ear pierced, stories about his car. I knew Tony for 40 years. In that time, he only owned 3 cars, including that enormous Bonneville that was probably 10 years old when I met him. Stories about this race, that race, on and on. What I realized, what made Tony special were the stories and the way he told them. Over the last few years, while he was recuperating at Westchester Medical Center, the nursing home up in Portland, and at home in Croton, I tried to visit as often as I could. Sometimes it was planned. Sometimes it was more spur of the moment. I'd call up my wife Lynn and say, I'm stopping to see Tony, and she would always reply with, okay, I'll see you in a few hours. Of course, those visits always became the long version of the stories or the longer explanation of a previously rendered story. One of the last few visits at the house, he told me about growing up around Yankee Stadium and hanging out at this restaurant where the Yankee players would usually have lunch or early dinner before the games. This was back in the days of Mickey Mantle, Roger Maris, Yogi Berra. Apparently, he was hanging out at this restaurant back when the players were still a little more down to earth, and Tony was able to meet these guys and get to know them pretty well.
The New York Yankees, and this goes back, players had to purchase their own. There was no clubhouse the way it is today. Before the game, an afternoon game, they had to go buy lunch. There was an automat under the elevated train, and the automat, you went in, and there were these glass boxes, and there was a sandwich in each box. So when I was very young, my father, my mother, and I would go to Yankee Stadium, and before the game, we'd go to the automat, and the manager would move us into the back room because he knows we're not going to bother the Yankees. What does a kid this big know? You walk around from table to table to table, and you end up meeting these guys, and you never knew that you're talking to baseball stars. You're talking to DiMaggio. DiMaggio, yeah, 50, yeah, DiMaggio. Hank Bauer, right fielder. Moose Skowron, first base.
As the story continued, he was telling me about a day that he didn't have to go to school for some reason and bought a ticket to the Yankees game that afternoon. As he went there often, he knew a lot of the ushers, and the ushers would, generally say, Tony, come here, sit in this box down by the first base dugout. And he's sitting there, and it's usually these are unoccupied boxes that businessmen own, and they would show up occasionally. So this day, he sits in the box, and a few businessmen joined him there. As bad as practice was going on, all the players who knew him from the restaurant were coming over and asking why he wasn't in school, and saying to the other players, hey, look, Tony's here. Meanwhile, these other guys that are sitting in the box are just mesmerized by the fact that this little kid knew all these players, and they would call him by name. Of course, the story was much more detailed and involved, because it probably took an hour to tell in his house.
You're going to hear it later.
Oh, good. While he was in the nursing home, I stopped by a few times. He was listening to a lot of music, and I asked if there was any music he needed that I could get for him. I was a little surprised when he asked if I could get some Ravi Shankar music for him. I was thinking, are you serious? Sitar music? Well, I ended up ordering a couple of CDs, the very best of Ravi Shankar, which certainly is a bit of an oxymoron, and the Concert for Bangladesh. I loaded them both on my iPod and gave the discs to Tony. So here's the sad thing. Now if I put my iPod on shuffle, inevitably the sitar music pops up every once in a while, and unbelievably I will now forever be remembered of Tony Sklarew by the sound of Ravi Shankar's sitar, as bizarre as that is. I'm sure I could go on with several more stories. I just want to take this moment to say that the last 40 years of knowing Tony were, shall I say, a unique experience. But Tony was certainly a unique individual, and I'm sure we will all miss him and his stories. On that last visit to his house, probably in February, I think, he told me about wanting to have this party at his house, and he was going to share all the sailing trophies with the crew. I was really looking forward to that party. Unfortunately, it didn't happen that way, the way Tony planned it, as we all are here today. I'm sure the storytelling would have been as outrageous as usual. I suppose we'll just have to entertain ourselves now and just remember him and all the tales that he told.
I just want to tell you two things about Tony that have stayed with me forever. As an ex-smoker, you know how rabid one can become in insisting on a no smoking policy everywhere. And Tony was a very heavy smoker, very heavy. Probably, I never saw him without a cigarette in his mouth. And I was trying to get Stuyvesant to establish a no smoking policy in the dining hall as well as any other closed area. Of recent time, the membership started including not only husbands who smoke, but wives who smoke. There was no getting away from it. So I didn't go to Tony. You know, he seemed like the last person in the world to go to. And you know, he came up to me unsolicited and said, "I agree with you. It's outrageous that they're smoking in the dining room." I couldn't believe it. From the mouths of babes. The other story I just want to quickly tell you is this. Phil's memorial was very difficult to do. I'm still crying about losing him. And, you know, I saw Tony in the yard. I don't know if it was the day of planning it or the actual day of it, whatever it was. And I said, "Are you coming to the memorial?" And he said, "I can't, but I love the guy." I can't tell you what that meant to me, to hear another man tell me that he loved Phil. It was very significant, very, very significant. I hope I mentioned it at the memorial. I don't know if I did. But it's a big loss to lose Tony. He was an exceptional, lovely, gracious, funny, human being, a real mensch, and I must say that I loved him a little bit too.
When I joined Stuyvesant in 1986 and brought my International Tempest Olympic class racing boat over to join the fleet, Tony was so welcoming, as was Phil Greenstein. I will never forget how both of them made me comfortable. I was a single woman. Most of the women were the significant other or the husband of a guy who had a boat, but I had my own boat and a racing boat. The Tempests were little Olympic class racing boats that had no engines. We raced heavy Olympic class racing on weekends, 2 to 3 races a day. Tony, if he was not otherwise racing, would be our committee boat. He would also be the head for the women aboard because there were no heads on our boats. So in between races, we would climb aboard Aliento, and he was the head, and we always thanked him. I have pictures, because our boats had no engines, if the wind died, we had to paddle home. Sometimes we were all the way out over here, and it could be a long paddle, particularly if we were against the tide. And Tony would just tie us up. We'd have this whole line of Tempests tied one to the other, and there are pictures sometimes. He was pulling back on Aliento, 8 or 10 of us to get us back to Stuyvesant so we could go home and be put away. I also remember the first time I did committee boats other than for Tempest racing was with him, and he was so organized. He had this loose leaf book about what to do to start races minute by minute. At 15 minutes before the first gun, you did this and you did that. And at 10 minutes, you did this and you did that. Down to the minute, and in the minute before the start, it was at 15-second intervals. Put this flag up, get this flag ready to drop. And it was a how-to manual. I also remember doing EBYRA or perhaps City Island Fall Series Committee on a powerboat that actually had an engine, and he had a shotgun. And we started the divisions with a real gun. The first and only time I've ever been around a gun, and I actually shot it. And that's when I decided my views about gun control are good ones. But Tony had so many skills. He could do everything. It was really amazing. He was always welcoming. He always was helpful. I was the first woman flag officer. There are some pictures in there that are delightful to see. Tony in a suit, I'm in a fancy dress, and I was the rear commodore, first woman flag officer. He's the commodore, and there's a picture of us both facing out. Boy, were we young and gorgeous. But the best about Tony were his stories. A story that would take me 2 minutes to tell, Tony did for 15 minutes. Embellished with embellishments that embellish the embellishments that embellish the embellishments. 2 of them I can remember. He would tell a story about how he would leave his doors open when it was warm, and he had this beautiful cat, which I see is in the photographs, the white Persian.
Lizard.
Lizard. I had forgotten the name. Thank you, Karen. And he's talking about one time he is petting an animal, and he thought it was his cat Lizard, but it was actually a skunk that had come in the door. Now, there's certainly a difference between the feel of a skunk's fur and a Persian cat's fur, but Tony's stories were great. There's another story that I will never forget, in which he talks about being out at the end of Long Island, and it was a very foggy pea soup night that is pretty typical for out that end of the island. And he talks about that the foghorns were going, and of course he would tell the story with the toot. He'd count 3 or 4 seconds, toot. And he said they were in this for hours, total pea soup, they couldn't see a thing. And 20 minutes later, as Tony goes through the story, and you get the total environment, and you didn't need a video or YouTube because he told it and you saw it. And he had to go forward to do something on the head sail, so he goes over the cabin top, and when he gets up there, it's totally clear air. Nobody knew for hours that the fog was low sitting on the boat. Maybe David was aboard. Were you aboard that time? But he told that story that had everybody in total stitches. It was terrific. So the Tony stories aren't just the Tony stories, it's the way he told them, and anybody who heard them knows exactly what I'm talking about. So Tony, out there at that big sailing place in the sky, we love you and we miss you.
I'm Ernie Babone. Many of you know me. I'm the Commodore City Island Yacht Club. We have our own or another memorial, which I'm running to right now. But Tony was a friend to all of us on the island. And while you're Stuyvesant, trust me, City Island Yacht Club, EBYRA, we all loved him, enjoyed his stories. And I want to thank you so much for allowing me to say that we do pass on our condolences and wish everyone well today. Thank you.
Speaking of the EBYRA, that beautiful brief that was delivered is from the EBYRA, and it is for us to take along on Tony's last voyage. And okay, yeah. And also food. I would encourage everyone to now visit the food, the omelet station, or all of the food, because the bar has been open long enough and we all need to eat.
Some of you are coming out on this last voyage today. Wish the weather was better, but looks like most of the rain is now gone. Might be a slight little shower here and there, but here's basically the plan. Some of the boats are going to be picking people up at the Morris dock. In fact, I think Fearless Captain's probably leaving pretty soon if we're going to do a 3 o'clock departure. Those coming on the Enterprise, and Karen knows who they are, we're going to go up by launch because I'm in this mooring field here.
Into the world of night, through shadows falling, out of memory and time, you're safe. We have come now to the end. White shores are calling. You and I will meet again, and you'll be here in my arms. Just